final word, Adam Collins and Geoff Lemon. Thanks again to Taha and Nikesh for being such giving guests. Nikesh mentioned it at the end, but having no time limit on an interview like that. In fact, he mentioned it after we turned off the tape. A lot of our friends who work in the cricket media have been doing loads of interviews around this, and it can be kind of hard to capture what's wrong with race relations inside cricket in the space of a soundbite over a 4 or 5 minute interview. But I think that's why it was so nice to have those two fine journalists on our program to give some thoughtful and detailed answers.
I think we're very fortunate that we work with a lot of really dedicated people with a lot of integrity, and it's a privilege really to be able to work alongside these people and hear what they have to say and bring that to a wider audience as well. So thanks to both of them for spending so much time with us.
Yeah, and also it can be quite exhausting if you are Taha or Nikesh who are receiving, without labouring the point, they are getting peppered with requests to do these radio and TV spots all day long. And they do some of them, but they were both keen to come and talk to us because they know that we are able to give them that space. And thanks to them for making it all possible. Just as a sort of thought that I had when we finished up on this, Geoff, which I sort of inserted myself in the story there, and I didn't mean to, but just my own experience of seeing it up front in Australian cricket recently, and there are loads of examples of racism in Australian cricket, by the way, both on and off the field. I've seen some revolting stuff off the field, even indeed within the cricket media, which just, floats on by because the path of least resistance, right? And we've got to be better at that. But dressing rooms, this idea that dressing rooms bring out the worst in people, and the adversarial sport is part of that as well. I don't think we should sort of skip over that point. Sure, cricket's part of the broader community and racism's a community and societal problem. I just wonder whether it's more acute in sport and in cricket, and we need to be mindful of that point too, that there is this idea, sitting around for hours and hours in dressing rooms, be it in professional teams or club teams. It's not an environment that's conducive to perhaps being your best self.
It's very much about, it's particularly a masculine thing, not to say it doesn't happen in women's sport. I'm sure there's some pretty dire situations there as well, but it seems so much of it is about people's idea of what being a man means, and that it being sensitive or being considerate is weak, and that being tough, being a smart ass is getting stuck into people, and it's all about, good, clean, masculine, macho fun. And when you're in a sporting environment, that's also a place where you're supposed to be your most masculine self. You're supposed to prove yourself physically on the field of combat. And you put those two things together, and that is the way it's likely to go. And so that is how it'll go until that idea, that sort of terror, there is this absolute terror of not being a proper man, not being the way that you think men are supposed to be, and that if you don't act like that, you'll be found out by those around you, and they'll realise that you don't really belong there, and they'll turn on you and they'll savage you. So you have to be as much of a prick as possible so that everybody will recognise that you're a proper man. It's a recipe for emotional stunting, and it's like so much of that idea about what a man is supposed to be is about, it's just a list of things you're not allowed to do. It's all about you can't do this, you can't like that, you can't wear that, you can't eat that, you can't drink that. There's nothing positive in it. There's nothing about what you should be, what you are allowed to do. It's all about the things that are prohibited to you. And so that's where the root of so much of this stuff comes from, I think, and that's the part that really needs to change for anything else to change.
Yeah, and that's really well put. And I kind of also was drawn to thinking about the Australian rules example in all of this. Now, to listeners who are not from south of the Barassi line, this may not mean an awful lot to you, but Aussie rules had an absolutely dreadful relationship with Indigenous Australia, especially. And I'm not saying it's perfect now, by the way, not at all, but it was acutely bad through the 70s and 80s when Aboriginal players started entering the big leagues, if you like. And and then again, really into the 90s. And there were some well-documented examples in the 90s. I'm thinking of Damien Munkhorst and Michael Long, for instance, where a light was shone on it, and it forced people to pay attention. And a club like Collingwood, for instance, who at the time, their president, Alan McAllister, responded to that in a way that was, well, kind of in keeping with what we've seen from Yorkshire, really, in recent months and across the course of the last year, basically saying it's all bullshit. Now, again, I'll pick my words carefully here because Collingwood have not covered themselves in glory recently, far, far from it. But the game as a whole, there has been this acceptance of Indigenous culture. There's been an understanding that it needs to be celebrated, and I think that has helped with some obvious horrible examples to the contrary. But taken as a whole, the game has made massive strides in terms of representation of Indigenous players, in terms of celebrating the culture that they come from, be it through rounds that are dedicated to Indigenous players and beyond, jumpers that are worn. I think about my own club, Hawthorn. We did not have an Indigenous player ever play for Hawthorn or drafted to Hawthorn until 2000. You know, that exclusionary policy of drafting, was it implicit institutional racism at Hawthorn at the time? Like, it's hard to say it wasn't. Why were other clubs selecting Aboriginal players and my club wasn't? You press fast forward 10 years from then, not even 10 years, and there was half a dozen to 10 players with Aboriginal backgrounds on the list because they had a change in focus, and that changed the conversation entirely. Now, I'm not saying that it's a copy-paste job from Australian rules, but there probably are some lessons there about what was done through that period between the mid-90s and maybe the 15 years that followed, and where some of the bits that have actually worked can now be retrofitted to English cricket, where there's clearly a problem that's of a similar substance.
Yeah, and I mean, so much of it is about the demographics of the sport. Like, it's notable that in a sport like Australian rules, where, say, the Indigenous population nationwide is, 2 to 3%?
Yep.
And on Aussie rules lists, it's been anywhere from 9 to 13% of the listed AFL players in the last sort of 10, 15 years, versus Australian cricket, where you can point to maybe half a dozen Indigenous players across the entirety of professional Australian cricket. You know there's a problem when you can easily name all of them. Like, that's when it shows you that's where the issue is. And so, yeah, there's clearly an issue with massive underrepresentation of British Asian players in cricket in the UK. That's something Azeem Rafiq talked about a lot. 4% of top listed professional players are English Asian or British Asian, when they're a much bigger percentage of the sort of community playing ranks. So until you get more representation, you're going to still run into this idea that these sort of players are the outsiders, the exceptions, the unusual, and those are the people who get targeted.
All right, Geoff, that might be where we leave it. I find it kind of, just thinking when you were talking there, that's the third time we've basically done a full program this year on racism. I mean, we'll keep doing this. We'll keep doing it. And some people probably won't like it. That's fine. If you've listened to this,
they won't be listening to this bit of the show. Yeah, hot tip.
They'll
they've
heard
the bit at the end.
Yeah, that's true. They'll have turned off. And we got a bit of backlash last time as well when we had Vish coming on after the Ollie Robinson saga, and when we spoke about January 26th back at the start of the year. That prompted some backlash as well. And look, that's fine. People are entitled to their opinions, but we're going to keep making shows like this because we think it's important, and we're going to have guests like Taha and Nikesh on to tell their stories because we want to use our platform for that. So again, thank you to them. Thanks for everyone for listening. Thank you to Brick Lane for their support of the show. To all of our patrons, patreon.com/The Final Word. If you are a patron, you'll receive a third discount on our live shows. Melbourne on the 13th of December at the Mission to Seafarers, and the 14th of December at Unibar in Adelaide. TBC, but coming up as well in Sydney on the 4th of January. This has been The Final Word. Adam Collins and Geoff Lemon will be back with story time on the weekend. Bye for now.
See ya.